Castles have always been formidable fortifications that would act as a prison for the enemy of the castle's custodian. These prisons were not prisons that we would know today. Sometimes prisoners, such as Elizabeth I in the Tower of London, was imprisoned under house arrest in a castle apartment. Recently we visited Lincoln Castle, which even had a real Victorian prison inside it to incarcerate criminals. However, today we investigate history's most notorious method of imprisonment, a castle's dungeon. Remember, if you do enjoy our videos, please support the channel by subscribing. A dungeon primarily is a room or cell in which prisoners are held, and these are usually underground or in the basement of a castle. Dungeons are usually associated with medieval castles, along with their reputation of torture. The word dungeon derives from the Old French term donjon, which was translated to a keep, the main tower of a castle. The keep as we know it today would be the huge classic image of a castle. The first use of the word in English was in the 14th century, which meant an underground prison cell beneath the castle's keep. In England, the new Norman keeps established after William the Conqueror's ascension to the throne did not have prisons within them. Only a few of these had means of imprisoning soldiers in the dungeons. In Scotland, dungeons were a lot more common. In the medieval times, imprisonment wasn't the usual punishment, and prisoners were kept awaiting a trial or whilst awaiting their punishment. In the 12th century, purpose-built prison chambers in castles became much more common, and they were built into gatehouses. Some castles had a large provision for prisoners. Many dungeons are simply a single plain room with a heavy door, in which gives the dungeon its only access. In a previous video we covered the oubliette dungeon, which was created just to simply forget about a prisoner. If you haven't already, please check out our video on this. Inside the dungeons, conditions would be simple, basic, sometimes brutal, but also cold. The classic dungeons were not heated and the conditions were aimed at brutally punishing a prisoner. A classic example of this is at the Tower of London. The Salt Tower, tucked away in the corner, housed the Jesuit priest John Gerard. Gerard would later escape the tower miraculously. However, his conditions would be grim, with the River Thames in the winter flooding and licking the walls of the tower, making his cell freezing. Now, when you consider the word dungeon, you straight away think of torture. For over 2,000 years, torture has been administered in a way to either extract information or for punishment. Inside a dungeon, this would carry on. Prisoners and inmates would often find themselves brutally chained up to the walls, restricting their movement to great frustration. Most of the brutal torture in which we associate with dungeons would actually take place in a separate torture chamber. Prisoners could even find themselves on the rack, with their limbs being stretched until they dislocate, resulting in severe agonising pain or even near death. After this excruciating experience, a prisoner would then be literally thrown back into their dungeon and cell, left to consider their injuries, pain and sanity. In history, prisoners of all social classes, standing and background were thrown into dungeons. These damp and dark spaces were used as holding cells aimed to imprison or break a prisoner. Inside the dungeon of a castle, one cannot comprehend the suffering that may have gone inside the walls. If you visit any castle in England, you will most probably see the etchings on the walls of a prisoner. These carvings or writings communicate the immense boredom that would also have added to the torture of an inmate. Some of the carvings are extremely elaborate and tell a dark story. Inside the Tower of London, there is a huge amount of this graffiti, and many of it is linked to religion. You can see crosses and religious inscriptions. These carvings could be linked to the Reformation, or could also simply be linked to God, in a desperate appeal for their freedom, safety, and for their ordeal to come to an end. Some prisoners also when inside a dungeon would be given a jailer. This person would be responsible for their prisoner, and sometimes positive rapports were created between the prisoner and the jailer. A jailer might be the only person a prisoner inside a dungeon may speak to all day, so their presence may have been something that the prisoners took solace in. Today, dungeons are seen as a huge tourist attraction that people flock to in order to learn about the gruesome torture that may have occurred inside the walls. Even in modern times, dungeons are still used to house prisoners and even torture them. In another video coming soon, we will talk about how torture has changed over time. I hope you've enjoyed this short but brief look into dungeons. If you haven't already, please support our channel by subscribing. Thanks again for watching.